Hey guys, tonight we're boarding an 18th-century ship, not the grand, heroic kind you see in movies, but the creaky, salt-stained sort that smells faintly of tar, sweat, and cabbage stew. You're standing on the deck, your coat stiff from sea spray, wondering how you ended up here and why every man around you seems to be obsessing over buttons. Yes, buttons. The tiny discs that hold your clothes together. You didn't think history could get more boring than rigging ropes and biscuit rations, but tonight you're about to drift off to the sound of sailors comparing fasteners like fine jewelry. Don't worry, you probably won't survive this voyage, but at least you'll be stylish when you sink. You lean against the wooden railing as dawn spreads a weak yellow light across the horizon. The ship creaks, its sails snap sharply, and the whole deck smells faintly of brine and brass polish. Buttons gleam everywhere on jackets, on hats, even sewn onto lucky bracelets. There's something hypnotic about them, like miniature suns catching what little light exists out here. The ocean stretches forever, flat and silver. The sky a lid of pale tin. And between them these men, tiny creatures clutching bits of shine as if they're proof they exist. The bosun, a grizzled man missing 2 teeth and half a thumb, sidles up beside you. He taps the brass button on his cuff and says, "Got this in Barbados. Cost me 3 coconuts and a hangover." You laugh, but he's serious. In this world, buttons aren't just buttons. They're currency, memory, and luck, a sailor's small rebellion against sameness. Everyone wears the same uniform, but no one's buttons are quite alike. A man's jacket might tell his story, where he's been, what ports he's seen, even whom he's loved. One sailor proudly shows you his mother-of-pearl button carved in Goa, traded from a Portuguese merchant. Another brags about a carved wooden one, shaped like a compass rose, gifted by a Maori trader. They talk about these things the way modern folks might brag about sneakers or watches. You realize that the ocean has made magpies of them, all scavengers for sparkle in a gray world. As the day rolls on, you join in the rituals of ship life, scrubbing decks, hauling ropes, trying not to get your fingers caught in pulleys. You start to notice how every sailor guards his collection. Buttons are sewn tight, patched over, sometimes hidden beneath layers of cloth. One young cabin boy even keeps a silver one in a pouch around his neck, whispering to it like a prayer. "For luck," he says. Historians still argue whether sailors truly believed these trinkets held power, or if it was just something to believe in when the world seemed endless and empty. By midday, the ocean turns green and glassy, the ship slicing through waves like a knife through melted butter. Lunch is hard tack and salted beef things that crunch and squeak in your mouth. But the men eat fast, so they can go back to sewing, polishing, and trading buttons below deck. It's a strange economy, half superstition, half boredom. A sailor might swap a brass button for a few sips of rum, or a carved coconut one for a night's worth of gambling chips. The buttons pass through hands like stories, each exchange leaving behind a little residue of laughter, salt, and smoke. When the wind dies and the sea goes still, you hear the hum of shipboard life, ropes creaking, seagulls crying, someone snoring in the shade of a cannon. A few sailors sit cross-legged, comparing designs under the dull light of the lantern. One shows off a French Navy button with a tiny anchor. Another flaunts an enamel piece shaped like a flower. You watch, half drowsy, as fingers trace circles and patterns, as if these bits of metal were keys to another world. And maybe they are little round passports to places long vanished beneath the tide. You can almost imagine it, A sailor stepping ashore in Calcutta or Havana, finding a button-maker's stall tucked between spice sellers and fortune-tellers. The smell of cardamom and sweat fills the air. He chooses a new button, maybe ivory, maybe tin, maybe bone, and pockets it, a token of a place that will soon fade into rumor. Later, on deck, he'll sew it beside the others, another chapter in a story no one will write down. The captain walks past, his coat gleaming with perfect symmetry, 12 gold buttons in 2 immaculate rows, each one polished to a mirror shine. You can see your own tired reflection in them. His buttons are regulation, official, unyielding. They tell no stories. They only command obedience. But the men's buttons mismatched, weathered, oddly beautiful, tell the truth of life at sea, chaos, hunger, laughter, hope. That night, as the sky darkens and stars emerge, you lie on the deck, your back against the cold planks. The ship rocks gently. You can hear someone quietly humming, the metallic clink of a button being tapped against wood. You realize these men don't just collect buttons, they collect proof of being alive. The world may forget their names, but their buttons will remember them. Tiny round witnesses to storms survived, ports visited, hearts broken. And as sleep starts to pull you under, you think of your own small souvenirs, coins, photos, screen captures, the things you hoard to feel that your life has meant something. Out here, under an ocean sky, you're not so different from them. Just another soul, clutching a shiny thing in the dark, hoping it keeps you from drifting away. The sea wakes you before dawn, not with violence, but with rhythm. The slow thump of waves against the hull feels like a heartbeat you've fallen asleep against. You rise groggily, brushing the salt from your hair, and find the deck bathed in a thin gray mist. The horizon's gone, swallowed whole. The only color comes from the brass buttons on the sailors' coats, little suns glowing dimly through fog. You think of them as miniature lighthouses, guiding their owners through this ocean of sameness. The crew moves in quiet, automatic motion, their eyes half-lidded from another night of interrupted sleep. There's talk of a storm brewing, not one of those pleasant storybook tempests, but the kind that makes ships groan and men pray. You overhear the bosun mutter, "Best sew your luck tight today." He holds up a small copper button, engraved with a spiral like a snail's shell. "Got me through 2 hurricanes," he says, deadpan. You can't tell if he's joking. By now, you've noticed a pattern. Before every storm, the men touch their buttons like talismans. They rub them smooth, tighten stitches, whisper to them. One sailor even nails a spare button to the mast for Neptune to notice. Historians still argue whether sailors truly believed in button charms, or simply needed something to believe in a small, shiny distraction from death's wide mouth. As the wind picks up, you help secure the lines, though your hands shake more from superstition than fear. The sky darkens with terrifying speed, clouds rolling like a black avalanche. The first raindrops slap your face sharp and cold. Lightning flashes not white, but green, refracted by mist. For a moment, it lights the deck, and every button gleams back like 100 watchful eyes. You could swear they blink. The storm hits. The sails thrash, ropes scream, men shout half prayers, half curses. The ship becomes a living creature, bucking under your feet. Water pours over the deck in sheets, washing away buckets, spoons, even a boot or two. You cling to the rail, drenched and deafened, watching sailors crawl like ants toward the rigging. One man loses his hat, and with it, a single silver button which vanishes instantly into the black churn below. He stares after it, horrified, as though he's just seen his own soul sink. The captain bellows orders, his voice cutting through wind and panic. Somehow, in this chaos, discipline holds. The sailors move like a single body, pulling, knotting, climbing. And through it all, their coats flash with the muted glimmer of brass and bone, little defiant beacons against the wrath of the sea. You realize these buttons aren't just decoration. They're identity proof of order when nature tries to erase everything. By midnight, the storm passes, leaving the deck coated in a glittering layer of foam and debris. The air smells of iron and ozone, like the inside of a cannon. You're trembling, exhausted, but alive. So are the men, though quieter now. A few kneel by the rail, pressing their fingers to their buttons as if counting blessings. Later, below deck, the ship rocks in exhausted rhythm. Someone lights a lantern, its glow pooling softly across faces and cloth. The men strip off their soaked coats, laying them flat to dry. Buttons clink as they unfasten them, the sound delicate and strangely soothing like wind chimes made of memory. You watch one sailor carefully polish a button with the corner of his sleeve. He murmurs something to it, a name, maybe, or a promise. He catches you watching and smiles faintly. "Kept me safe again," he says. You nod, too tired to ask if he means it literally. Sleep comes heavy, like the tide. But even then, your dreams are filled with buttons tumbling through water, shining among shipwrecks, winking up from sand like lost coins. You dream you're diving after one, reaching through a dark, silent ocean, your lungs burning. Just as your fingers brush the metal, you wake to the rocking of the ship. The sound of rain has faded. Somewhere above, the sun is rising. The next morning, everything glows with the washed-out clarity that follows survival. The deck is slick, the ropes are stiff, and the men's laughter feels softer, more genuine. Breakfast is hard tack again, but someone finds a scrap of dried fruit, and it feels like treasure. The boatswain declares the sea forgiven, and everyone chuckles, though no one really believes the ocean forgives anything. You notice one of the youngest sailors' freckles, barely 16, sitting quietly by the rail. He's holding a small wooden button carved with the shape of a whale. You ask him where he got it. "My brother made it," he says. "He never came back from his first voyage." He pauses, tracing the button's outline with his thumb. "I figured if I kept this, maybe he'd stay with me a bit longer. Something about that stays with you all day, how these buttons, worthless to anyone else, are monuments in miniature, tiny reliquaries of faith, fear, and affection. Maybe every sailor stitches a piece of someone he loves into his coat, carrying it across oceans, daring fate to notice. Maybe that's what makes the sea bearable. As the wind softens and the sails swell again, you find yourself touching the small brass button you picked up from the deck earlier, a relic from the storm. It's warm now from your skin. You slip it into your pocket. For luck, you tell yourself, just in case. Above, a gull cries a bright, lonely sound against the vast calm. The horizon stretches clean and blue, as if nothing ever happened. The ship glides forward, leaving behind the storm, the fear, and the memory of 100 buttons gleaming bravely against the dark. The sea has gone quiet, too quiet. The deck hums with a restlessness that no amount of rope coiling or deck scrubbing can ease. You can tell the sailors are itching for land, for color, for the taste of something that isn't salt. Even the seagulls have abandoned you. Days blend together like wet ink, one blue horizon bleeding into the next. When, at last, someone spots a dark line on the waterland, the mood shifts instantly. Men cheer. A few start singing, off-key and half-sincere. The ship's carpenter even polishes his buttons for the occasion, muttering that shiny things attract good fortune and merchants with loose purses. You're headed for a port on the coast of West Africa, a place the crew calls Gold Coast, though they seem more interested in rum and stories than gold. As the ship drifts closer, you can smell life again. Wood smoke, pepper, wet soil. The sea changes color near shore, turning the green of old glass. Once anchored, the captain grants shore leave. The sailors pour onto land, like children released from school. You follow them through narrow alleys buzzing with markets. The air is thick roasted nuts, coconut oil, sweat, and something sweet that clings to your tongue. You pass stalls selling everything imaginable: beads, fabrics, charms, dried fish strung like garlands. But what catches the sailors' eyes and yours are the button traders. Their tables glimmer like treasure chests overturned. Buttons carved from horn, wood, coral, bone, and metals you can't name. Some are rough, handmade, the size of bottle caps. Others are delicate things painted, etched, inlaid with bits of shell. A dark-skinned merchant with bright eyes waves you over. "English ship, yes?" he says, grinning. "You trade, I trade. Buttons, good luck. Each one has story." His voice rolls like a drumbeat. You watch as the sailors begin swapping. A tin button for a carved bone one, a brass one for a coral piece shaped like a sun. One man even trades his entire cuff just for a button carved with a small elephant. Historians still argue whether these trades were cultural exchanges or the earliest forms of souvenir capitalism. You can call it what you like. The sailors call it survival of the most decorative. The merchant tells you that certain buttons are thought to protect travelers. One, carved from cowrie shell, keeps storms away. Another, from red coral, ensures a safe return home. Whether you believe it or not, the air around the table hums with reverence. These aren't just fasteners, they're promises in miniature. You notice something else. Buttons serve as a silent language. Without speaking a word, sailors and merchants trade not just goods, but recognition. A brass anchor button says Navy. A carved whale says whaler. A simple round of pewter might say poor, but honest. Out here, everyone wears their story on their sleeve literally. That night, back aboard the ship, the men are buzzing with energy. The lower deck glows faintly from lantern light, flickering across piles of new acquisitions. You watch them line their buttons up like soldiers, bragging softly over who got the rarest find. One sailor claims his came from a button maker who used gold dust in the varnish. Another swears his was blessed by a priest who lived on nothing but bananas. It's half boasting, half lullaby. Out here, stories are worth more than money. They make the long nights shorter. Later, as the ship pulls away from shore, you stand at the stern, watching the coastline shrink into the haze. In your hand, you hold the button you traded for a small disc of bone, etched with lines like waves. It's cool and smooth, heavy with meaning you can't quite name. You imagine the hands that made it, the person who wore it first, the 1,000 small exchanges that brought it to you. The crew settles into the familiar rhythm again, ropes tightening, sails creaking, gulls fading. But there's a new liveliness below deck now. The men polish, stitch, and show off their new treasures. A few have sewn buttons into secret places inside their coats, close to the heart. Others wear them openly, glinting like defiance in the sun. You overhear two sailors debating whether the buttons from Africa are luckier than the ones from the Caribbean. "That depends," one says. "Do they still work after you lose your hat?" The other laughs so hard he drops his needle into the bilge water. Somewhere between their laughter and the ship's soft rocking, you realize that buttons have become the sailor's way of measuring the world. Every voyage adds a few more to their jackets, a few more to their stories. They aren't rich in gold or glory, they're rich in shine. When the sun sinks that evening, the deck glows with its last light. The men line up to eat stew and ship's biscuit, again, and the buttons catch the amber sunset, glimmering like captured fire. You feel a pang of affection for these tiny circles of light, for how they hold the reflection of everything that passes, and yet never truly rust. In the fading glow, you can almost believe that these buttons really do contain something powerful, a trace of every hand, every shore, every whisper of trade and trust. Maybe that's the real magic of the sea. It turns even the smallest things into relics. As the stars rise and the crew drifts toward their hammocks, you tuck your bone button into your pocket once more. The ship hums softly beneath you. The ocean is calm. The world feels stitched together by thread, by memory, by buttons. The morning smells like tar and tea, a strange combination that somehow works when you've been at sea too long. The deck is damp but quiet, the horizon a clean line of blue stitched neatly across the sky. You notice the captain inspecting uniforms again, his face unreadable except for that twitch of disapproval that could make a man's knees buckle faster than a rogue wave. The inspection isn't just about tidiness, it's about hierarchy. The brass buttons on the captain's coat glint like medals of divine authority, while the sailor's mismatched ones tell a story of rebellion in slow motion. You watch him pass from man to man, tapping buttons with a polished stick. "Standard issue," he says to one. "Unacceptable modification," to another. When he gets to you, he eyes the small bone button you stitched to your sleeve and mutters, "Sentimental nonsense." Still, as he moves on, you notice the faintest flicker of envy in his gaze. His own gold buttons are perfect but empty. Later, as the men gather for morning duties, you hear the soft murmurs of discontent. No one dares speak outright rebellion, but their buttons speak for them, small, round protest banners gleaming under the sun. One sailor has replaced his regulation brass with carved wood from Jamaica. Another has stitched a row of mismatched ones from 3 different navies. It's fashion as quiet mutiny. You find yourself wondering if this is how revolutions begin, not with muskets and banners, but with needle and thread. Below deck, the air is thick with salt, sweat, and whispered creativity. The men have started swapping sewing tricks as if planning a secret code. One shows how to thread 2 buttons close together to make them look like eyes. Another suggests painting tiny initials on the backs, invisible to officers. "A man's got to leave his mark somehow," one of them says, tugging at a stubborn stitch. Historians still argue whether sailors' button customizations were tolerated or punished. The records are foggy, like the sea itself. But you suspect it was one of those gray areas, the kind that kept morale afloat and captains pretending not to see. One evening, a faint argument breaks out near the galley. A sailor named Briggs is accused of stealing another man's copper button 1 that supposedly came from a Spanish frigate. Voices rise, tempers flare, and for a moment it seems like fists might follow. But then, the cook, an old Caribbean man with a laugh like rum being poured, steps in and says, "If you can fight over it, it ain't yours to begin with." Everyone laughs, the tension dissolves, and the button gets returned. You realize it's not just about possession, it's about pride, story, and the strange democracy of glitter. By night, the ship settles again into rhythm. You lie awake in your hammock, listening to the buttons clinking softly as the men shift in their sleep. It sounds almost like rain, a lullaby of rebellion. The next day brings inspection again, but this time something's different. The captain seems distracted. His uniform is immaculate, but there's a small gap, one missing button near his cuff. You notice it immediately, but no one dares point it out, except the bosun. He gives the faintest grin and says, "Sir, might be time to borrow one from the crew." The captain scowls, but later you see him below deck, quietly threading a spare brass button in place. For a fleeting second, he looks almost human, a man trying to hold himself together with the same fragile stitchwork as everyone else. Over the next week, the atmosphere aboard changes. The rigid lines between officer and sailor blur ever so slightly. You see the first mate helping mend a torn coat. The ship's carpenter fashions a button from a piece of driftwood, hands it to the youngest sailor, and says, "Now you've been to sea." And somehow, through this small act of vanity and craft, unity creeps in. The buttons, once symbols of difference, start to mean belonging. One evening, while the sea glows like melted glass, you sit near the bow with Briggs and a few others. They're comparing buttons again, but this time with less competition, more warmth. One of them pulls out a small tin of paint and begins decorating the plain ones, dabbing colors onto metal like a child finger painting in church. "A bit of cheer for the next storm," he says. You laugh, realizing the irony. These men live surrounded by the most beautiful blues on earth, yet they crave color. Maybe that's what buttons give them, something bright to hang on to when the sea is endless gray. As the conversation drifts, someone brings up the captain again. "He's not half bad," one man admits. "Saw him polishing his coat this morning. He's got that missing button back." "Whose was it?" another asks. No one answers, but you can guess. Before turning in that night, you look down at your own sleeve. The bone button is still there, snug and smooth. It's no longer just a souvenir, it's your quiet badge of endurance, a small rebellion sewn by hand. You can almost hear it whisper as you drift towards sleep. Hold fast. The ship sways gently beneath you. The buttons clink softly like lullabies made of brass and courage. And as you close your eyes, you realize that even in a world of storms, orders, and salt, beauty always finds a way to slip through the seams. The air thickens with heat as the ship sails farther east, the sky blinding and the deck hot enough to fry a biscuit. You've learned to squint permanently, to breathe through your sleeve, to exist in a shimmer of sweat. The sailors' uniforms fade from navy to salt-stained beige, and their once gleaming buttons grow dulled, darkened, and crusted with grime. Yet somehow they become even more treasured little circles of memory, catching the faintest light of foreign suns. Land appears again, rising out of haze like a mirage. The captain calls it Ceylon, though the local pilots call it something else entirely, a word that rolls like soft thunder. Palm trees line the shore. The air smells of cinnamon and wet earth. As you step onto the dock, you notice every man suddenly straighten his jacket, brushing his buttons clean. This isn't vanity, it's diplomacy. Buttons are the first handshake in a world without common words. The port is a riot of color and sound. You move through a maze of stalls where merchants shout over each other in 5 different languages, spices piled high in woven baskets, parrots squawking from rafters. Somewhere, a sitar hums through the noise. And then, again, you see them, the button sellers. These aren't like the ones in Africa. Here, the buttons are carved with extraordinary care. Ivory discs etched with lotus flowers, ebony rounds inlaid with silver, shells so thin they glow when the sun hits them. You pick one up, and it feels cool, almost alive. The merchant grins, tapping his temple. "From Seashell," he says, "for courage." You trade away 2 brass buttons for it. The exchange feels oddly intimate, as though you've traded memories. not metal. Elsewhere in the market, sailors barter for buttons made from bone, horn, and coral. Some are shaped like animals: elephants, turtles, birds. One man proudly displays a button carved from what he claims is a meteorite, a piece of sky, he says, eyes gleaming. Historians still argue whether these buttons were truly made from meteoric iron or just clever salesmanship, but either way, the legend stuck. Ikan. By evening, your pockets jingle with strange treasures. The deck becomes a gallery of tiny art pieces, each sailor showing off his haul. The cook has one that smells faintly of sandalwood. The bosun wears a flat shell button so luminous it looks stolen from the moon. You sit with them as the sun sets in molten orange. A light breeze carries the smell of cinnamon and salt, and for the first time in weeks, the men are quiet. The world feels heavy with warmth, the ocean breathing slow and deep below. Someone begins humming a tune, slow, lilting, half lullaby, half sea shanty. The sound mixes with the creak of the ship, the distant laughter from shore, and the faint metallic chime of buttons brushing together. That night, as you lie on your hammock, you catch yourself thinking about all these objects, small, decorative, and yet so charged with meaning. How humans everywhere seem to crave stories made tangible. A carved shell, a piece of bone, a sliver of stone, each one says, "I was here." In the stillness, you recall a conversation from earlier. One sailor had asked, "Why do we even need these things? They don't feed us or fix the sails." Another replied, "A man can live without bread for a while, but not without memory." The others laughed, but you didn't. You knew what he meant. You dreamed that night of a button maker in some faraway workshop, a woman perhaps, sitting cross-legged by lamplight, carving patterns into tiny circles of ivory. Each line she cuts connects her to a man she'll never meet, who'll wear her work into storms, across oceans, maybe to his grave. She doesn't know his name. He'll never know hers. But for a moment, their worlds touch through art, through commerce, through the simplest act of human creation. When dawn comes, the ship's bell rings, and you rise to find the deck already alive with motion. The sailors are mending lines, packing barrels, and polishing their buttons again, an unspoken ritual before departure. You see Briggs carefully sewing his new coral button onto his jacket, tongue caught between his teeth, needle glinting in the sunlight. When he's done, he sits back proudly. "There," he says, "proof I've been somewhere worth remembering." The captain strides past, giving the faintest nod of approval. Perhaps even he understands now that these tokens are more than decoration. They are history stitched to fabric portable museums of the human heart. As the anchor lifts and the ship slides away from the dock, you feel the strange weight of your own buttons against your sleeve. Each one hums with a memory. The storm, the laughter, the markets, the moonlight. You wonder how many centuries of travel they'll witness, how many hands they'll pass through, how many oceans they'll see. The wind fills the sails again, and the ship turns its wooden face toward the east. The deck smells faintly of cinnamon still. You close your eyes, the sunlight warm on your skin, the faint clinking of buttons keeping time with the pulse of the waves. For a moment you forget where the sea ends and the story begins. The long blue middle of the voyage finds you. Days stretch like rope. Nights fold over them like canvas. You wake to the same sounds, blocks squeaking, water hissing along the hull, a spoon clinking an empty tin, and you can feel the crew's minds fraying like old lines. Boredom is the real storm here, and the first mate knows it. He bangs the bell, announces useful amusements, and pretends not to see the rum jug making casual, well-informed circles. You sit cross-legged on the warm deck with a needle, some scavenged thread, and a small pile of buttons. Around you, a quiet industry blossoms. Sailors who last week looked like spawn. Bundles of rope now reveal secret talents, neat hands, patient eyes, and a flair for tiny flourishes. Briggs produces a sailmaker's palm, like a stage magician revealing a dove. Another man polishes a bone disc until it glows like a moon rising from his palm. Someone has rescued fish scales from yesterday's gutting and says, perfectly straight-faced, that they make excellent, ethically sourced sequins. You decide not to ask about the ethics. Out here, the fish union is notably silent. The contest begins with no official rules, which is, of course, the first rule. A judging line of mugs is set along the capstan, each filled with a different bribe, a raisin, a pinch of sugar, a swallow of rum. You thread your needle, feeling absurdly nervous, the way you might before a piano recital, if the piano were a coat and your audience had knives. The bosun calls categories in a voice that pretends to be gruff, but is clearly delighted. Best sea creature. Best memory of port. Best button for making the captain frown. You start with a small shell disc, bought back in that cinnamon-scented port. The thread slides through like a secret. You stitch a faint spiral on its face, a slow galaxy, then edge it with 2 tiny knots you learned from the carpenter ornamental, but sturdy enough to survive a squall. Across from you, a sailor named Hooper embroiders a coral button with a miniature kraken, each tentacle a single long stitch that curls like steam. It is both menacing and adorable, like a cat that pays taxes. The rum does its work. Conversation loosens. Laughter bobs up like cork. Tales are told in careful stitches and generous exaggerations. One man claims his meteorite button sings in thunderstorms. Another swears his mother-of-pearl disc reflects the future if you stare long enough, which is also how he once missed his watch. Historians still argue whether these shipboard craft sessions counted as formal time off or simply mutinous morale maintenance, but you can feel what they really are: survival by ornament. You add a second button to your set. Brass this time, salvaged from a torn cuff. Into its face, you embroider a tiny anchor with a wandering line of blue that pretends to be the sea. A gull lands on the rail and watches you, the unimpressed supervisor of your creativity. Someone tosses it a crumb. It misses, squawks, and looks personally offended. You promise yourself you'll never be judged by a bird again, which is optimistic given how many birds the sea has in stock. As midday swings past and the sun softens, the contest grows oddly serious. The cook, with hands that know heat and knives better than thread, stitches a button depicting a pot with 3 little steam curls. The men cheer like he's just invented dinner. The carpenter carves a button out of driftwood, then burns a compass rose into it with a heated nail. You can smell the faint sweetness of scorched timber, the same smell that lingers in your memory from the captain's missing button moment, that quiet reminder that even brass and rank need mending. A mainstream fact floats to the surface as the rum does. The grog ration, that daily mix of rum and water, introduced broadly in the 18th century, steadies hands and spirits alike. Admiral Vernon famously ordered it diluted, and sailors, with their usual respect for authority, immediately nicknamed him Old Grog, after his coarse grogram cloak. You raise your tin cup at the memory of a man who tried to keep discipline and accidentally invented happy hour. Afternoon tilts into the golden hour. Shadows climb the mast like sleepy cats. You take up your third entry. The bone button etched with wave lines from the West African market. This one you edge with a fine whip stitch, and then, because boredom has sharp elbows, you couch a hair-thin strand of rope fiber into a loop that forms a tiny cresting breaker. It's a ridiculous amount of work for something the size of a coin, which is exactly why it matters. The men nod with the solemn approval given to foolishness that keeps you sane. Quirky tidbit time arrives with a giggle. Hooper reveals that he uses stale ship's biscuit as a pincushion. It's perfect, firm, forgiving, and allegedly nutritious if you get desperate. He demonstrates, and 3 weevils emerge like disgruntled landlords evicted from a rent-controlled loft. The crew groans, laughs, and agrees that the biscuit is now mixed use. The judging begins at sunset, because of course it does. The light is kind, the breeze kindlier, and the world seems temporarily interested in being easy. The first mate, who pretends not to care, inspects each button like a tiny pearl of statecraft. He awards best sea creature to the kraken, the tentacles curl winsomely in the fading light, and best memory of port to a shell disc with a minute lotus scratched into it, its petals like sighs. You, to your surprise, win Best Captain Frown for your brass anchor. Apparently the blue line looks like a smirk. You consider embroidering no offense in microscript along the edge, but the ship rolls, and your eyes cross just imagining it. Between categories, stories spill out. A quiet older sailor tells of stitching through a storm, needle between his teeth, because superstition said a half-finished button invited bad luck. Another confesses he once bartered a cuff's worth of brass for a single hug in a cold northern port best exchange rate of my life. The men laugh, tender around the edges. For an hour, you all become curators of tiny museums pinned to cloth, docents of the past that refuses to stop knocking. A debate flickers up like a spark and drifts harmlessly. Were these contests allowed because officers knew craft steadied the crew, or tolerated because enforcement would snap morale? Historians still argue whether officers quietly supplied thread and needles or confiscated them until the ship's surgeon complained about the mental weather. You suspect both are true, depending on the sea, the captain, and whether he'd recently misplaced a button. Night comes friendly and slow. The lanterns are lit. Their halos wobble across decks and faces. You're given a prize for your category. A thimble hammered from a scrap of copper. It's slightly too big, which is perfect. You'll grow into it, or rather your confidence will. The bosun leads a final toast. The rum tastes like oak and smoke and the long patience of barrels. You think of the cinnamon port, of the coral kraken, of the captain with his gap discreetly mended, and you feel the ship knit itself together around this evening of gentle rivalry. Before turning in, you tie your 3 entries in a little row inside your jacket, a private constellation where only your heartbeat will visit. The buttons feel cool for a moment, then warm. They take your temperature and keep it. You remember the boy with the whale button, the meteorite brag, the fish scale sequins glittering faintly like winter stars that forgot their season. Outside, the ocean strokes the hull, patient and endless. Inside, 100 small circles hold fast. You slide into your hammock, and it cradles you like a well-phrased sentence. Somewhere a fiddle begins a slow tune. the bow drawing out notes that feel stitched rather than played. You close your eyes to the soft clink of buttons, the tame growl of water, the aftertaste of copper and sugar. In the dark, you think not for the first time that craft is a kind of prayer you make with your hands when your mouth is too tired for words. The ship answers with a long, drowsy creak, meaning understood. You've lost track of how many dawns the sea has given you. The days have become an unbroken shimmer of horizon and habit the same meals, the same chores, the same quiet rituals of keeping sanity stitched together. But there's a new energy aboard now, something sharper, faster, more secret. The men whisper more than they talk. Packages change hands. Threads are pulled from uniforms and replaced with better ones. There's rumor of a new trade, not of tobacco or sugar, but of buttons. It starts small. A merchant spotted in a previous port had offered good coin for any unusual naval specimens, meaning buttons from foreign uniforms. The older sailors pretend to ignore it, but you notice their eyes gleaming like brass in candlelight. After all, what's a sailor to do when he's seen half the world and owns almost none of it? So the buttons begin to move. Quietly. Secretly. One night, you're below deck, half asleep, when you hear the faint metallic rattle of a tin box opening. You peek through the shadows and see Briggs crouched beside a lantern, carefully sorting through a dozen mismatched buttons, some French, some Dutch, one clearly from a Spanish officer's coat. He counts them softly, as though they're coins. "Worth a week's pay ashore," he murmurs. You whisper, "You going into business, Briggs?" He jumps, nearly spills the lot, then grins sheepishly. "Not business. Legacy." He winks. "Collectors pay well, and no one hangs a man for selling shine." He's not wrong. The Naval Code forbids smuggling rum or contraband goods, but buttons fall in the cracks between rules. Historians still argue whether this underground market was truly illegal or simply tolerated as the price of boredom. Either way, the trade spreads faster than gossip. By the next week, half the lower deck is in on it. A sailor might trade a scrap of cloth or a day's ration for something rarer, a mother-of-pearl button from India, a carved whalebone from the Pacific, even one rumored to be cut from an officer's own coat during a drunken card game. They call them sleeping spoils. Soon, the collection grows elaborate. Boxes appear beneath hammocks, tins hidden behind barrels. One sailor has even built a false bottom in his trunk to hide a row of gleaming brass tokens. He taps it affectionately and says, "My retirement plan." At night, the trading begins a soft, murmuring market that glows like embers in the lantern light. Buttons clink like whispered currency. Men speak in coded phrases. "Got any French stars?" "Only Portuguese sons, mate 1 for 2. Deals are struck with handshakes and nods. The captain suspects something, but says nothing. Maybe he knows better than to crush the only joy left afloat. You begin to see the irony of it all, that these men who own so little, who are paid in promises and salt, have found an economy of beauty. Each button becomes a treasure, each trade a quiet assertion that life can still be gilded, even when it's bound in rope and order. Then, one evening, trouble arrives. The ship anchors off the coast of Lisbon, and a few men are granted leave to trade their souvenirs ashore. But someone no one ever learns who tries to sell a French officer's button with the imperial crest still visible. Within hours, naval inspectors board the ship, all stiff uniforms and suspicion. They search the bunks, turn out the hammocks, demand to see every jacket. You stand by as sailors empty their pockets, pretending indifference while trying to look innocent. The air hums with tension, and the faint, almost comical jingling of hidden contraband. One inspector finds a carved bone button in the cook's apron and holds it up. "What's this?" he barks. "Decoration," says the cook, deadpan. "Keeps me from crying into the stew." Laughter breaks the tension. And somehow, miraculously, the search ends without punishment. The inspectors leave, grumbling about wasted time. But the moment they're gone, the crew bursts into hushed cheers. Briggs slaps the cook's shoulder and declares him saint of subtle lies. That night, in the low warmth of the galley, the men gather for what feels like a celebration. Someone brews tea mixed with stolen rum. The buttons, once again, come out polished, admired, traded. You realize the smuggling isn't about profit anymore. It's about defiance. Each secret button is a quiet no to the endless obedience the sea demands. You ask Briggs if he ever worries about getting caught again. He shrugs. "What's the worst they'll do? Take the buttons? We'll just start over. The ocean's full of shine." The phrase sticks with you, the ocean's full of shine. You look out through the porthole, and the moonlight on the waves seems to agree. Every ripple flashes silver, every crest a new coin in motion. There's talk among the crew of one day opening a button shop on land, selling curiosities from every corner of the world. African bone, Indian shell, Spanish brass, English enamel. You can almost picture it. A tiny store tucked on a foggy street, smelling faintly of salt and varnish. An old sailor behind the counter saying, "Every button has a voyage in it." Historians, of course, would later romanticize this trade. They'd call it the informal maritime economy, a polite phrase for something closer to longing in disguise. But for you, standing on deck that night with the wind brushing your face and the sea whispering its ancient lullaby, it's simpler than that. These buttons aren't just proof of where men have been. They're proof they were someone. Proof they mattered. The lanterns sway softly, shadows moving like tides along the planks. You feel the hum of the ship, its heartbeat steady and slow. Somewhere below, Briggs is probably counting his stash again. The cook hums a tune that sounds suspiciously like prayer. And in your pocket, a single carved shell button presses against your hand, smooth, warm, alive with memory. You can almost feel the ocean breathing through it. It's years later, or maybe just feels that way. Time stretches thin when the sea refuses to change. The same gray swells, the same rhythm of sleep and labor, the same faint shine of buttons catching morning light. But one afternoon, a new sound rolls across the deck, a dull, wooden thud. Someone's found a trunk. You're on shore now, older, slower, and only half convinced the land beneath your feet isn't moving. The port smells of smoke and sweet rot. You've left the ship behind for good, soldiered out, as the sailors say, but the sea hasn't quite let go of you. You can still hear it inside your head when everything else goes quiet. That steady hush of water against wood. The trunk turns up in an estate sale, an unlabeled, salt-stained thing that looks as if it's been waiting centuries to be noticed. The auctioneer calls it miscellaneous maritime effects. Most of the crowd yawns. You, of course, raise your hand. When you open it later, the smell hits you first. A mixture of brine, old wool, and something metallic, like coins forgotten in a pocket. Inside, wrapped in canvas so brittle it crumbles at your touch, is a sailor's jacket. The cloth is faded to the color of fog. But the buttons, oh, the buttons still gleam faintly. A constellation across the front. You run your fingers over them, one by one. Bone, brass, coral, shell. There's even a single carved wooden one. its grain spiraling like a fingerprint. Each button is different, yet together they tell a story as seamless as the sea. You can almost see the man who wore it, leaning against a rail somewhere, stitching his life into fabric. There's a folded scrap of parchment in one pocket. You open it carefully. The ink is faded, the handwriting cramped, but you can make out the words. For luck, for laughter, for the places we won't see again. You sit very still. The world seems to tilt not with the sway of a ship, but with the pull of memory. The air hums with ghosts. Historians still argue whether sailors' personal effects were ever meant to survive. Most were tossed, burned, or buried at sea. Yet every so often, a trunk like this resurfaces, a small miracle of wood and patience. The experts write papers about it, measure every fiber, trace every thread, but none of them will ever know the weight of that parchment in your hand, or the way your throat tightens when you read it aloud. You take the jacket home. Under lamplight, you clean it gently, button by button. Each one releases a faint trace of its origin, the sharp tang of salt, the sweetness of sandalwood, the ghost of rum and smoke. You imagine its journeys, through markets and storms, across decks and continents. The coral button might have been traded for a song in Zanzibar. The brass one, polished nightly by a man who needed order more than air. The shell one, bought for luck and kept for love. In a quiet moment, you realize you've become the custodian of a stranger's life, a museum of one exhibit, and somehow, it feels right. That night, sleep comes late. You dream you're back on the ship, but everything's different. The deck glows faintly, not from lanterns, but from thousands of buttons scattered across the planks, catching the starlight. The crew moves silently among them, not walking, but drifting, their faces serene. The captain's coat flashes gold as he nods toward you, and Brigsolder, maybe, but smiling tosses you something small. You catch it, and it's warm in your palm, a familiar bone button etched with waves. When you wake, your hand is empty, but the feeling remains a weightless warmth, a sense that something has been passed on. You decide to donate the jacket to a museum. The curator is polite, clinical, and fascinated. She calls the buttons a remarkable cross-cultural artifact. You want to tell her there's something more, each one a pulse, a heartbeat trapped in metal. But you just nod and sign the paper. Months later, you visit the museum quietly, blending in with tourists. The jacket hangs in a glass case under soft light. A plaque reads, "Sailor's coat, circa 1760. Materials, wool, bone, brass, coral shell. Provenance unknown." You stand there for a long time. People pass by, glance, move on. But you stay, listening to the faint hum of air conditioning that somehow sounds like the ocean. You wonder if anyone else notices how the buttons seem to shimmer, as though remembering sunlight. A small boy presses his face to the glass and whispers, "They look like stars." His mother smiles and tugs him along. You want to tell the boy he's right, that the sailors wore galaxies on their sleeves long before telescopes showed us the real thing. That each button is its own planet, its own orbit of stories. But you say nothing. You simply watch as the reflections of the lights ripple across the glass. And in that shimmer, for just a moment, you swear you can see the sea again. Weeks later, you return to the museum not to see the jacket again, but because you can't quite stop thinking about it. You wander past glass cases filled with sextants, compasses, ropes, and anchors, all meticulously labeled with dates and origins. They look impressive, but lifeless. Tools of precision without the pulse of people. Then you turn a corner and find it. An entire hall dedicated to maritime miniatures. It's quiet in here. The air smells faintly of varnish and time. And there, under carefully dimmed lights, sits a long display labeled Buttons of the Sea, Artifacts of Sailor Life, 1700-1820. The sight makes you smile. Behind the glass are hundreds of buttons, some no bigger than a thumbnail, others broad and ornamental, glinting faintly like coins from forgotten kingdoms. Each one is pinned to a board with a small tag, its description printed in calm museum prose. Ivory, Portuguese trade route. Copper alloy, Caribbean origin. Pressed horn, believed to bring good luck. You lean closer, your breath fogging the glass. You recognize a few styles from your own voyages, the bone spirals from Africa, the etched coral from the Indian Ocean, the plain brass discs used by English deckhands who'd traded polish for superstition. They look like the same buttons you once held in your pocket, though these now rest behind glass, like captured prayers. A guide approaches, her voice gentle. Most of these were recovered from shipwrecks, she says. The ocean preserves metal better than fabric. Buttons last longer than memory. You nod, staring at the tiny circle of brass that gleams under the light. So these, you ask quietly, are the last things left. Usually, she replies, they tell us where a sailor might have come from, what he wore, how he lived. Sometimes we even find initials scratched into the back. It's how we name the nameless. Historians still argue whether sailors intended their buttons to carry meaning or if meaning simply clings to anything that survives long enough. But as you watch the glass glimmer with faint reflections, you know the truth doesn't really matter. Time gave these small things a voice, and that's enough. At the far end of the hall, a new display catches your attention. A magnified photo of a buttons engraving. Enlarged 100 times, the grooves and scratches look like coastlines on a map. The plaque reads, "Button recovered from the wreck of HMS Albatross, 1779. Microscopic residue of candle soot suggests nightly polishing, likely carried by a junior sailor. You imagine him immediately, some young boy barely 16, rubbing that button with a scrap of cloth, keeping it bright against all odds. Perhaps he was the one with freckles, the one who'd shown you his whale-carved charm years ago. Perhaps not. The sea swallows names, but sometimes spits out symbols. As you move along the exhibit, you start reading the small print beneath each artifact. Recovered off the coast of Barbados. Traded in Goa. Believed to be of Polynesian craft. Each entry feels like a breadcrumb trail across oceans. You can almost hear the overlapping hum of voices, the men who carved, sold, traded, and wore these tokens. You realize you're walking through a gallery of ghosts, all speaking the same soft language: click, polish, stitch, survive. Then, something stops you. Near the center of the display, under a spotlight that makes it glow faintly pink, is a coral button etched with a tiny anchor. The tag beneath it says only, "Unknown sailor, found in a trunk aboard a recovered merchant vessel, late 18th century. Your heart stutters. The same button. It's the one you found in the trunk, the one you gave to this very museum. You lean closer, tracing its faint outline through the glass. For a moment, the world tilts again. You hear waves in the hum of the lights. You smell salt and smoke. You see a dozen faces laughing over rum and thread, a deck glowing in sunset, and a hand tossing you a small, shining thing that felt warm as life. Someone behind you whispers, "Beautiful, isn't it?" You turn. It's the curator from before, holding a clipboard and smiling softly. "We had it analyzed," she says. "The coral came from the Indian Ocean. The carving was done with a bone tool. Crude, but careful. There's even trace ash inside the grooves, maybe from shipboard fires. You nod, struggling to find words. It's strange. How much of a person can fit in something so small? She studies you for a moment, then says, "Objects remember what people forget." Her words hang in the air, like the scent of the sea itself, quiet. True, impossible to explain. You linger there long after she leaves, staring at that coral button, until the museum lights dim for closing. You watch its glow fade slowly, until all that's left is your reflection in the glass. You look older now, yes, but not empty. The shine has moved. Outside, night has fallen. The air is cool and damp, and somewhere nearby, a gull cries. You walk home through the drizzle, hands in your pockets, and smile when your fingers brush against something smooth. Another button, the brass one, the first you ever kept. It's worn down to a dull gleam, but it still feels alive. And for a brief, impossible moment, as the rain patters softly against your coat, you could swear you hear the ocean again. Not roaring or raging, just breathing. Slow, familiar, eternal. You don't plan to visit the museum again. But months later, while walking along the harbor, you catch sight of the water and realize you've been listening for that old rhythm, the ship's heartbeat, the soft, metallic clink of buttons against cloth. It calls you back, quiet but insistent. The sea is gray today, the kind of gray that feels like memory. Gulls wheel lazily overhead, their cries dissolving into wind. Fishing boats bob at their moorings, paint peeling, ropes swaying. You lean on the railing and watch the tide lap at the stones, the same way it did centuries ago for men whose names no one remembers. Somewhere beneath that surface, you imagine 1,000 buttons lie scattered like coins in a wishing well. You think of all the hands that touched them, calloused, scarred, patient. Of how every sailor who stitched one to his jacket must have known, deep down, that the sea would eventually take it back. And still, they sewed. Still, they believed in a circle of brass or bone, holding their stories together. That evening, you find yourself writing not a log, not a report, just a letter you'll never send. You write it as if to those men, to Briggs, to the boy with the whale button, to the nameless sailor who left his coat behind. You'd laugh if you could see your buttons now, you write. Behind glass, admired by children and scholars. They think you were collecting curiosities. But I think you were collecting proof that the world noticed you, even for a second. Historians still argue about the meaning of small things. Some call them relics, others refuse to call them anything at all. Yet sitting by the window with the smell of salt drifting in, you understand what the academics never will. That survival isn't just about the body. It's about the traces left behind the stitch, the polish, the soft mark of thumb against metal. You imagine the old ship again, not in glory, but in peace. The deck washed clean, the sails folded, the air still. Buttons glint faintly in the fading light, tiny suns holding their glow as the day dies. The men are gone, the stories half remembered, but the shine remains. It always does. You decide to keep one of your own, the brass button that's traveled with you all this time. Not for luck, not for memory, but as a reminder of something the sea taught you. That permanence can live in imperfection, and that even the smallest things can anchor the soul. The next morning, you walk down to the pier. The wind bites, but softly, as if testing your resolve. You hold the button between your fingers one last time, warm from your touch, and toss it gently into the water. It arcs through the air, catches a spark of light, and vanishes with a sound so small you might have imagined it. For a moment, nothing happens. Then, the ripples widen, overlapping, glimmering. You stand there until they fade into stillness, and for the first time in a long while, you feel whole. As you turn away, the harbor seems brighter. The world continues, ships leaving, gulls circling, waves folding endlessly into one another. You slip your hands into your pockets and walk home, lighter now, as though you've finally given the sea back what it was missing. And if someone were to find that button years from now, smooth, dulled, resting among shells, maybe they'd turn it in their palm and wonder about the life it came from. Maybe they'd guess at the story, or invent one of their own. And in that moment, you'll exist again, quietly, like a shimmer beneath the tide.